So I'll start by talking about the scale of the challenge, the financing options to address the gap, and then what does this all mean for you and the diverse type of organizations that it's listening into the webinar. So what do we know? We know that reaching the Sustainable Development Goals is going to cost a lot. It's probably not where you think, or at least the majority of the costs are not talked about at the moment. There's a lot of discussions on finance at the moment, mainly around three topics. The first topic is on the construction of infrastructure. We have ongoing discussions on the cost of pipe versus non-pipe systems, appropriate technologies, low-cost technologies, high-tech and everything else in between for different contexts. The second topic in the sector that we talk about is the costs for the whole water and wastewater chain, from source protection to treatment and reuse, and this came a lot back into the discussions because of the SDG Goal 6, which is more than universal coverage water and sanitation. And we also have the discussions around promoting the private sector, creating demand, decentralized small businesses for rural water. But all of these discussions are still revolving around infrastructure, and the attached financing discussions are very much about how households can pay for it. So these three discussions are very important, don't get me wrong, but they are really at the tip of this iceberg only, and they're mostly about construction costs. The major financial discussions that we actually need to have in the sector revolve around the need for major irregular maintenance and replacement of old infrastructure, and even more important, the cost of the people that actually ensure that the services are provided and regulation is enforced. And other costs that we also have to consider are the costs of borrowing, which are important in the grown-up finance discussions. I want to bring a concrete example to the table. I want to take you to Southwest Ethiopia, to the district of South Ari, and I see some of my colleagues from there are actually on the webinar as well. The rural population and peri-urban population is about 250,000 people, which are served by a combination of shallow and deep wells and also some small gravity schemes. They have in total about 241 schemes in this area. Coverage is between 20 or 60%, depending on which indicators you're using. And non-functionality is at the moment at about 31%. But what I want to tell you about is Omo. This is Omo Guderso. Omo is one of the rural water engineers in South Ari. He's part of a 12-people team. They have their salaries covered, but they have only one motorcycle, which is actually used by the head of the department to go from his office to home and to go to meetings. So Omo and his colleagues have no allowance for fuel or for per diems, and they have no maintenance funds either. So they basically leave the office and follow up with the communities when there are NGOs coming and doing their assessments. And this is how Omo and his 12-people team are expected to monitor the service to 250,000 people. I know that this example is not unique, and many of you are experiencing this in many other parts of the world. I just want to keep an eye on the chat to see if there's, okay, no more audio issues. So coming back, a recap. There's only 6 costs that we all need to talk about when we talk about finance and when we discuss finance. So these are the life cycle costs. Many of you already know them. CapEx short for infrastructure construction or for capital expenditure, operational expenditure or OPEX for minor maintenance, capital maintenance expenditure for large irregular maintenance, and then direct support for all the people and institutions which are directly involved in service provision. And Omo would need to have more than his salary covered to ensure sustainable services in his district. Omo is part of the direct support. And indirect support for the costs at the regional and national level, the regulators, the planners. Finally, if there are loans involved that need to be paid back, we need also to consider the cost of capital for larger loans. This is actually more than you might think it is as an overall percentage of costs. So 6 cost components. We also know the scale of the challenge. All the links in this presentation are hyperlinked to the sources, so you can always go back to where they come from. So this is the most quoted World Bank figure at the moment. To reach SDG 6 for both water and sanitation, it will require $114 billion a year just for CapEx. This is the tip of the iceberg only, and it's 3 times more what it's currently being spent. Aid, or ODA, reached only 18 billion in 2014. This is still very important in many countries, but it's decreasing, and it's surely not enough to cover the huge financing gap. Capital maintenance, the large repairs, capital maintenance expenditure, it's estimated to be 1.5 times the amount needed for CapEx, for those 1.5 times more, those 114 billion. Can all the speakers please mute themselves? Yes, thank you. We also know that by comparing the budgets of some countries, but there's not much data on this, that the absolute minimum needed for the direct support is about $1 per person per year for rural water and sanitation. We don't know how much this is required for the whole enabling environment for sanitation only, for instance. And there's the webinar, the RWSN webinar on Thursday. It's just going to be about this specific cost, and there's one in English and one in Spanish. So now, we also know that as coverage increases, the costs of the enabling environment become increasingly important. On the bottom x-axis, you have the coverage rates, and on the y-axis, the sector efforts and costs. As coverage increases, so as more you go to the right, we need to increase the spending on capital maintenance, which is the red part, and on direct and indirect support, which is the blue part. If we have no change in expenditure, there is a stagnation of coverage between 60 and 80% as countries are pumping more investment into infrastructure, but the existing one fails at a higher rate. And what we start seeing is what I call flatlining. Now I'm just going to show you to illustrate this point. Again, this is from the data bank of the World Bank. This is from data on coverage from 1990 to 2015 from Uganda and Tanzania. So you see Uganda flatlining and Tanzania as well. I'm showing you these 2 countries because I also know well the amounts of investment that have gone into the sector since 2005. And I mean, both countries have a huge increase in investments in the sector, and they are not being reflected in the increased coverage. And the countries are both grappling with increasing non-functionality, with increasing population growth, and it's simply pumping money into a sector that it's not seeing its results. So this is the scale of the issue. Financing options. We know there's limited sources of finance for WASH. I told you about the 6 cost components, and there's also only 3 sources of finance that you need to know, and they are part of the financing discussions. The 3 T's: tariffs paid by consumers, taxes paid by citizens at national or local level, and then redistributed through sector budgets, and also transfers, international aid, ODA. Some few countries are also lucky enough to have their own resources, mostly from natural resources. And then there's this big gray box, which is the large financing gap. Where we want to be, on the right side of the sector, is to be able to increase the very low tariffs at most of the countries where we are, especially in rural, to increase taxation that is actually redirected to the sector, and as we are seeing the transfers, ODA, decreasing. But we have a problem. I mean, if tariffs and public finance available are not enough and are not growing fast enough to address the amounts required, so what can we do? So it's the same if you need to buy a house or a car or throw a big wedding and you don't have the money. You can do one thing: you borrow. And this is where we bring in private finance. This is a slide from our colleagues at the World Bank from their latest great publication on blended finance, also with a source attached to it. So private finance, just again on definition, so we all know what we're talking about. It's either what we call commercial or private finance, which has high, usually standard high interest rates and short repayment periods. Or on the other hand, we have concessional finance, which has usually lower interest rates and has a grace period. For instance, you don't need to pay back your loan within the first 10 years. Either way, this is debt and it needs to be paid back. But this is a very simplified slide. The reality is much more complex because we need a combination, for talking about grown-up finance, we need a combination of this public and private finance. And there are many different mechanisms to do this. I come to the most important slide of the presentation because for each type, and I'm going to spend some time here, so for each type of the finance available, we need to understand what we're talking about. And for each new type of finance that comes as a silver bullet, we need to question its true outreach. And I want to give you a framework for having actually these discussions in your country. So on the x-axis, you have the amount of risk for paying back loans. So AAA is low risk. It's a high credit rating, usually matching with high-performing utilities and usually urban utilities. Then if we go to C credit rating, this means higher risk, which is typical of the centralized providers and less well-performing utilities. And on the right side of the slide, you have the higher risk with no credit rating. This is really the spectrum of no formal utility providers, the centralized providers, and a lot of the rural areas that we work in. On the y-axis, you have the amount of finance required from very low to very high. So a couple of important points on this slide. The first one is that at the moment, a lot of the finance available for water and sanitation and what you call innovative financing is really on the bond financing, on that purple top left, and project financing and also commercial financing. So the purple, the yellow, and the red. But these are all the equivalent of the Rolls-Royce side of the financing spectrum, or what we can also call for this webinar, the grown-up finance. They require very sophisticated governance systems, high efficiency of utilities, proper regulation, developed financial markets, and a lot of criteria that actually many countries don't have at the moment, not even for urban water. The second important thing is that all of these finance mechanisms require some match from public finance. So you see the blue part all around the slide is public finance. Public finance is required to basically reduce the risk of the private investors and make the sector attractive enough. And the more we move to the right side of the diagram, this is where there's more risk, and this is where more public finance is needed. And actually, most of the poor usually fall also that don't have access fall into this area of the service spectrum. In most wealthy countries, universal water and sanitation coverage was achieved through a combination of public finance, private capital, and tariffs. So therefore, most low and middle income countries actually have two possible approaches to finance water, rural water, and none of them is rocket science, is to actually increase public finance for water through either taxations and to improve the efficiency of the sector to collect tariffs. I mean, and then there is a combination of mechanisms that we are going to talk about more in this webinar. So moving to the grown-up finance side of the discussion, we really need to know how much funds do we have, how much do we need, and then what mechanisms are we going to be using to finance the gap. And you might think this is easy, but from 75 respondents to the WHO GLASS report of this year, only 8 countries actually reported implementing consistent sector development investment plans. These were Guinea, Botswana, Cote d'Ivoire, India, Panama, South Africa, Uzbekistan, and Venezuela. And only 4 countries actually cited using multi-year budget or expenditure frameworks for the sector and indicated that these plans were consistently followed. And those were all urban, and they were Albania, Senegal, Mali, and Pakistan, no rural multi-year budgets for rural areas. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, why is this happening? Why is this so difficult? There are multi-year sector expenditure frameworks for other sectors, for health, energy. So there are people with the capacity to do this in the country. So why is this not happening? SWA, Sanitation Water for All, they did a small research, some colleagues did a small research with the finance ministers that attended the high-level meeting earlier this year at the World Bank. And this slide summarizes the perception of the finance ministers. So it will be very difficult to change the expenditure allocations at national level to the water sector without any data, and worse, without actually showing progress of the existing investments. So if you were a finance minister or part of his or her technical team, and you see on one hand increased investments to the sector, and on the other hand you see decreasing and stagnating access, you also would be reluctant to invest in the sector. You would start asking a lot of questions. Actually, as a side note, for all the countries that achieved universal access within one generation, this was actually achieved with the prime ministers and presidency back up and championing the sector. So I think we are actually aiming our efforts a little bit to the wrong ministers, or a little bit too low in the ministry level. So what? This looks complicated and difficult. So where to start? What can you do? Where can you support this? So if you're working at national level, we need to influence the right people at the right time. We need to understand in detail, and I underline detail, the country budgeting processes and the organizations involved, their interests and the constraints. And once you know exactly who they are, you actually can understand where they need you and with what type of data. So this can't be generalized. This needs to be very specific. If the objective is to ensure prioritization of WASH in national and local expenditure plans, well, you need to develop a detailed advocacy strategy which describes who are you going to influence and how. If, as I firmly believe in this, we need multi-annual sector plans, which need to go way beyond the money for the construction of the infrastructure for that tip of the iceberg, we really need to understand why are they happening? Why don't we have multi-annual sector plans and support that process? So what are the real reasons for not having them? And let's start experimenting with grown-up finance for rural water. Start discussing with private finance what is possible and what is not by combining public and private finance mechanisms specifically for that right side of the diagram on the rural spectrum. So last week I was in Uganda, and so a lot of the examples now are from Uganda. And in Uganda, for instance, BRAC graduated from MFI to a bank, and these are the type of stakeholders you can start having the discussions within the countries on interesting blended finance for rural water. And finally, the last point for the national level. You can support civil society organizations to hold governments accountable to the SDG and its financing. There are CSOs, civil society organizations, specialized in budget tracking and budget accountability, and you can support them so they are actually aware of the budget issues in the water sector. And you can help also the CSOs in the sector to talk about money, because not enough of us are talking about money and having these discussions. Another example from Uganda, the Civil Society Budget Advocacy Group. So they're doing a great job in budget tracking and asking the right questions. I follow them on Twitter, but I have never seen a tweet on the water sector. So there are many organizations like this in other countries. Let's work with them, and let's also tell them what are the issues specifically from the water sector. If you're working at district level, we need to start supporting the professionalization of asset management for rural water. This thing of just failing, of fixing on failure is not enough. We don't not fix our roof until it drops on our head. We keep doing small improvements, so actually we still have a roof. In rural water, we just wait for failure, and then hopefully some of these systems are actually rehabilitated, and it's very costly. This is very silly. We really need to have proper asset management. We need to have developed sector plans and budgets that match with asset management of rural water. And you can help, maybe you can help bring together the stakeholders to work on this in specific districts. But then again, raising 10% of a small, so if you're putting all your efforts into raising the budget for the water sector by 10%, say, this is still 10% of a very small budget. It's still not enough money. So we really need to start understanding the tax base at the moment in the districts where we work. What's the potential for raising local revenues? Again, this is how we did it in the countries that have now universal access to rural services. And once we have this clear, we can start bringing experimentation again on financing mechanisms to the decentralized service providers. So, for instance, also from Uganda, this just came out this year. It's about Ugandan tax base. Connect with these organizations that are already working in these areas. You don't have to have all this expertise in your organizations. You can work with those that have it. My last slide. Finally, well, this is the same. This applies to rural and urban. Improve efficiency of service providers. The World Bank and others will tell you. Deliver proper services, raise tariffs to cover at least minor and large maintenance. Only then we will be able to start having the discussion with private finance and attracting additional finance. So I think that's it. These are also some of the key resources that I've used, some of the latest literature around these topics. And thank you very much for your time.